Personally, I'm really excited to get started with this series of videos. And we're going to focus on rig graphs and using rig graphs to create some procedural rig setups. I say that I'm excited because when I first learned about Apex, it was the rig graphs that really interested me. And then when I dove in, I quickly realized that rig graphs are very, very complicated. They can be extremely esoteric, especially when you're first getting into it. But what I've learned after a while of working with them is that a lot of it is kind of just repeating the same procedures. So if you really focus on the basics and try to keep it as simple as possible and experiment, you'll get the hang of it. And once you get the hang of it, it's actually a lot of fun. While Apex can do just about anything, like I even saw somebody making some procedural trees using Apex. Check him out. He's on our station. But in this series here, we're going to focus mainly on rigging. To start off, I'm going to fix my window setup here. There's a couple of things that I'd like to have open as I'm working on my rig graph. And I got this nice big widescreen monitor, so I'm going to take full advantage of that. So I'm going to press Alt bracket, open up this bottom window. I'm going to go to Animation and Apex Network View because I will definitely need this. I'm going to open this up over here, my geometry spreadsheet. So I have my window here, geometry spreadsheet, and then I'm going to open up one more window here, and this is going to be my rig tree. Okay, so and then you can always go up and save this as a desktop. I already have one saved, so and then in here I'm gonna go to dark gray because I like dark gray. So to start things off, let's make a geo node, and I'm gonna do my typical 3-arm or 3-joint skeleton here, kind of like an arm. And we're just gonna go and pack this directly. Whoops, that needs to be, keep on typing, scale. There we go. All right, let's create our first auto rig component, and we're gonna put this as an FK transform. And the reason I'm throwing this down is if we unpack this, we can see that, again, we want to just grab the rig, so we don't grab the geometry. So we can see that all of our transforms, all of our connections have been set up. So otherwise we would have to do this manually, right? So the way to do this manually would be to, put down an Apex edit graph, throw that into here, and then this would be our base rig, right? But we don't want to do that. It's nice to actually just start, if you're going to build things manually, like we're about to do, it's good to throw down the Apex auto rig component first because that creates all of your connections. And one of the most important matrices that need to be filled out is the rest local down here, right? So every one of these has their rest local all set up, and the parenting is all set up, and then the input parameters are all set up over here. The input parameters allow us to actually interact with our rig. So if I throw down an animate node, we see that we have these nodes in here that we can work with. And that's because the input parameters are exposed. So I'm going to put a pin in this so that even if I have my scene animate selected, this will stay here. So this is pretty cool. Now that we have our rig, right? Our rig graph here, because this is the rig, right? So now that we have our rig graph exposed, let's edit our rig graph. So I'm going to throw down an Apex edit graph, and let's unpin this so we can actually see our edit graph node. Cool. So now we can go in and change things around. We can add transform objects. We can, cut connections, all sorts of fun stuff. We can do whatever we want. But the thing is if I throw this directly into the scene animate, it's not going to work, right? It's just going to turn up blank. So what we need to do is we need to pack this again, right? Let's drag this over here. And directly from our pack folder, this goes into the first slot. And let's let's see, let's unpin this. So let's check this out really quick. So we have our base skeleton, right? This is in our rig tree up here. So we have our base skeleton and our base rig, right? So on our first pack folder, we have the base skeleton. That's what's being created when we pack it. And then as soon as we put down our auto rig component, our base rig is being created, right? That's the name of our rig. We can name it whatever we want. Super rig, whatever. And then it gets updated up there, but we're just going to keep it to base. And then once we unpack it, we're basically opening up our rig and giving ourselves the ability to go in and poke around and change things. But now that it's unpacked, we need to pack up our rig again. So within the pack folder, we just want to put our base skeleton, right? So that's going into the first slot. And then the second slot is going to be our base rig. See? So now we've just created our hierarchy again. And then we throw this into the scene animate. Let's reset everything. And now we have our rig again. So when you're creating tools and you're just doing general experiments, this is a great setup. So what we're going to do, let's start doing some experimenting. Okay, so since this is pinned right here, I don't need to have it selected in order to see it there. So I'm just going to highlight my scene animate so that I can see how things update. So let's make just a quick transform object that'll move around this entire rig. So I'm going to jump into my rig graph here, and I'm going to put down a transform object. I'm going to change the color. We'll change it to red just to differentiate it from everything else. And okay, let's give this a name. Let's call it parent. And this is going to be the parent that controls this 0.0, right? Because if we look at our hierarchy, it's 0.0, 0.1, 0.2. So we want to control the whole thing. So let's create another object, right? This parent that'll move around everything. So the idea would be that you just take, if we look at these, right? If we look at these, we can use these as an example. So the X form is going into the parent, local X form going into the parent local. But if you really want something to be controlled properly, you just need to just throw in the X form to the parent. Okay, let's go to the scene animate. Let's reset. Okay, so that is parented, right? It is parented, but we don't have access to this parent yet. And that's because this input parameter has not been promoted, right? Which means that we cannot access this control. So if we go to our list of params, right? Our input parameters, if I just take where it says next here, if I just take that and just drag it right into the T slot, that's for our translation, rotation, and scale, you see that all of a sudden I have a little dot here, right? There it is. So now I can move this around and I can take the next and expose the rotation. So now we have rotation. So now I can rotate, and then I can also scale. Just a very, very simple parenting operation. So we created a control, we've exposed its parameters, and we parented it to the 0.0 joint here. Now, the issue with this setup is if you are working on a rig that potentially has hundreds of nodes, right? It's really complicated and you're moving pretty far down the rig. You're not gonna want to sift through hundreds of different nodes to try to find, a certain point or a certain control to make a change. And really, the workflow is you're not supposed to do that. There's another option to get around that, and that is through a rig component. So let's think about how to set this up, but within the context of a really complicated rig. So I just dragged this over, the skeleton and the pack folder. So we're just going to use it again. We're going to put down another auto rig component. Okay, so we just set up our FK. We'll unpin this because you don't want to see that anymore. And now let's throw down another auto rig component. Okay, so this is going to be, we'll call this parent component. And I'll put down, let's see, I'll put down an unpack. Whoops, I want an unpack folder. So now we have this unpacked. Let's make sure we're just grabbing the rig. And there's a few things going on here. Let's see. So just a moment. Okay, so the reason I'm only getting a bone deformation here is because I forgot to change this to FK transform. There we go. Okay, so now we have our same setup as before. So now within this parent component, here's where things get interesting, right? We're going to create another Apex graph. We're going to pipe it into the second slot, and we're going to create our first component script. So one thing I'm going to do here within my Apex network view is I'm going to split it into two sections. The left is going to be my actual rig, right? Like the state of my rig. And the right is going to be the component script that I'm about to write. So that as I write my component script, we can see how our rig is being updated. And just underneath this unpack folder, I'm going to put down an Apex layout graph. Let's unpin this and pin it again. So now we're looking at the layout graph node. And what's nice about this node is that it essentially, like say we have like a bunch of nodes that don't have any connections. They'll just get bunched up on top of the parameters. But what the layout graph does is, you can kind of move things around so that you can, if you need to, you can, display things a little bit easier. And or you can look for like a group name or an offset group. So it's just it's a pretty handy way to visualize your rig a little bit better. So I have the layout graph here. So now let's jump into our parent script and actually start messing around. I'm going to throw down a scene animate. We're going to go directly from the parent component to the scene animate just to see how things are going along. So this is all set up. And so with this, within our Apex auto rig component, what we're going to want to do is we're going to use the second input. But typically when you use the second input and the basic graph hasn't been set up yet within our component script, it throws an error. And it'll still even kind of throw a little bit of an error or a warning even when this is updated. So what I like to do is I like to create the basic setup first and then use the second input just so that I don't get that warning or error. So to start things off, we need our input parameters and our output. So when you put these down, the first thing you need to do is rename these. So these need to be output and params or parameters. And because if you don't have, especially the output name properly, it'll typically throw an error, right? Because by default, Apex typically looks for an output node. And if it has all these underscores like it just had, it's not going to be able to find it. So now we need to update this graph, right? We need to tell the graph exactly how to update. And that's what the component script does. It looks at your graph. It can go through and find different nodes and say, okay, create this node, connect that node, this and that. So we don't have to go through our entire graph and wire things by hand. So the way to start our component script is to extract the character. So that what we need is the graph name and the character. Now within graph name, I'm going to put down rig name. And what this does is it automatically grabs the name of our rig, which is, again, remember, base rig. And then we need to update the character graph. So we'll throw in graph name there, character to character, and graph to graph. And then character goes into the output. So this is our basic setup, right? That's about as basic as it gets. And now with that, I'm going to go and use second input. Great. So we don't have any errors. That means that this is working. And I can go into my scene animate, reset, and everything is working properly. Great. So this is the most basic setup. Again, with this rig name here, if I were to say something just like rig, and then go to my parent component, and then update this right here, I now have the option to specify the name of the rig, right? So now I have these input parameters in here, which I can access on the actual component node right there. Just for cleanliness sake, I'm just gonna, if you just type in rig name, it automatically grabs the name of the rig. Everything that we do in here is going to happen between these two graph inputs and outputs, right? This output goes into here. We do a whole bunch of stuff, and that finally goes into this graph input there, and then gets updated to our rig graph. So just to start things off, let's add a node. So look over here as I do this. If I pipe that in to the graph and then output over here to this graph, all of a sudden we have a node, right? It's just a blank node. If I were to go back over here to this graph, we want to recreate this setup, but we want to do it procedurally. And I need to put in a transform object. And obviously this is not a transform object. It doesn't look anything like it. So if I go back over here to my component script, press F, I have the option to specify what kind of node I want to make. And that's within the callback. So if I say transform object, I now have a transform object. And the callback is basically the name of the actual node, right? So, if there were like a set point transforms, scale set point transforms, and I wanted to add this to my rig script, or I'm sorry, my rig graph, I would input this scale set point transforms into the callback slot. So if you need the name of a node, you don't remember what it's called, just look for it here, type it in, value string or whatever, and you just basically copy this into the callback, and then it'll create that node in your rig graph. So I can also give this a name. So why don't I actually create a parameter that I can fill out on my auto rig component node. Okay, we'll call this parent name. Okay, and then output this value to the name. So if I go here and update this and just simply call this parent, now our transform object, right, that we just created is called parent. And I can even change the color. So let's make this a blue, right? So RGB, fill in the B with 1, and now we have a nice blue transform object over here. Okay, so we've created our parent. Now remember what we talked about before about promoting these values over here, these vectors, the translation, rotation, and scale. So now we need to promote those, right? So in order to do that, we have to find this port. So let's put down a find port node. So the graph goes into the graph, the node ID goes into the node ID. Within here, by the way, to open that up, to open up the parameters, just select the node and press P in case you were having trouble with that. So now we have the option to actually specify which port we're looking for, right? So we're looking for T, and that's going to be T in, right? T brackets in. And, for instance, if we wanted the out, it would just be, you guessed it, T brackets out. So we're looking for the in. Now we want to promote that input. Okay, so we're going to promote that input. So graph goes into graph. The port ID comes out of this find port, and it goes into here. Here, we'll keep it like that so we can kind of see a little bit better. And the param name, well, the parameter name, we can call it whatever we want. One thing we can do is if we want to, like if we go up here, it says like 0.2T, 0.1T. If we want to keep that naming convention going, what we could do is we could put down a format, a string format node, right? And we're going to grab this string, right, that's coming from the parameters, and we're going to pipe that into the arguments slot right there. Okay. So we're going to say name param. Okay. And now within the format string, what we're going to do is we're going to put curly brackets. And what that does is it basically just grabs the input string. And then I'm going to say underscore T. And now if I put this into here and put the graph up to there, this is now promoted and it's called parent T. That's awesome. So now I can go in and I can move it around. I now have control over that. All right, let's organize things a little bit because things get messy pretty quick within our component scripts. Okay, so now I want to do the same thing, right? I want to get the rotation. So let's just grab this. I'll hit Alt and drag it out, and we'll put the graph up into here. So we want that node ID from our, we'll just call this add parent node, right? So we want that same node ID. Let's color it red. Okay, so the port name is going to be R in this case, right? Because now we want to promote the R value, right? We want to promote rotation so that I can rotate this. Okay, so let's see. And then graph goes into graph down here, right? So we kind of want like this chain of graphs. Like we want we want the graph wiring or the graph flow to flow through and then end up at our update character graph input right there. So let's just go ahead and promote that R value. So that goes up to here. Now R is promoted, but it's not named properly, right? So I'm going to do another string format, right? Just take that, drag it down, and then call that R, and then pass that into the parameter name. And now we have parent R. Great. So now we can grab our parent and we can rotate it and we can do all sorts of cool stuff with it. But it's still not controlling this, right? We want it to control our shoulder joint. So that means that we need to somehow tell the graph to wire in this X form to that parent right there. So we need to find this node, right? We need to find that node right there. So one quick way to find a certain node that you're looking for is to use find node. Okay, and in order to find the node, you need a path attribute. So let's create a new value string, and we're going to call this child name. Okay, so let's rename these. It's going to be parent and then child, just to keep things organized. So the value is going to go into the path, and now we need to grab the graph that's being extracted, drag that, put that down there. And now we have our child node. And one thing I like to do to kind of keep my my component scripts somewhat organized is I like when I typically find a node, I'll put that into a null, call this node ID, and call this child node. So now I have my node, right? Also, I'll do the same thing here with my parent node, call that parent node. So now I have these nodes, right, my parent and my child node together. And you'll see why in just a sec, because these node ID values are important for what we're about to do. Okay, so I have my child node. Oh wait, no, I don't, because I have not gone up here and updated my parameters yet. So now the child node is going to be 0.0. Okay. So now the child node should be locked in. So I have my parent node, child node, and now we need to make a connection between the two of them. We're going to put down a node called find and connect input. So we're going to take this graph output here from when we promoted the rotate. We're going to put that into the graph, and the parent node is going to go into the source node input here, right? So the source and the destination node is going to be the child, right? Because we're going to go from the parent, which is the source, to 0.0, which is the child, right? And then within here, if we open up the parameters, we're going to want to put our X form into the parent. So let's put that into here for now so that we can see it when it updates. So xform into parent. So it's shifted around, and now our xform is connected to our 0.0 parent. All right, and we can color this whatever we want. Now, if I go into the scene animate, reset, I now have the exact same setup as I did in our manual setup, but now it's happening automatically. So that's how component scripts work.